Zaki Hassan is your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Hi everybody, as this episode drops, it is October 1st, 2018, and that is the 50th anniversary of director George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. The creepy classic not only led the late Mr. Romero to sequelize himself over the next several decades with Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and more, but his film also gave birth to an entire subgenre of continuations, remakes, and parodies, all paying homage in big ways and small to where it all started, Night of the Living Dead. Everything from The Walking Dead to Shaun of the Dead to 28 Days Later owe some piece of their success to what Romero and writer John Russo managed to pull off with no budget, no stars, no extended locations, and no color, lo those 50 years ago. And here to discuss the 50-year history of the Romero zombie on screen, as well as the broader history of the zombie genre, is my guest, Dr. Arnold T. Blumberg, who has a new book, Journey of the Living Dead, which is out right now. Arnold, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you joining me.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, talk to me about your history with zombie movies. I feel like everyone has that one moment. They were at the wrong age when they were exposed to it, and it just planted that the virus took root, if you will.
Well, it's only in recent years that I've really kind of nailed down exactly where my personal experience with it may have started, and I don't have 100% clear memory, but the story I'm now telling is that I think the first time I ever really saw a zombie movie or a part of one was watching Halloween 2 and seeing the clip of Night of the Living Dead in Halloween 2 and being intrigued by this other movie. Yeah. So that may be the first time. I certainly know that Night would have been playing quite a bit on like the late night channels. I might have encountered it somewhere around that same time, but I don't have a clear memory of a specific starting point. But I know that Halloween 2 was a big part of it. So, and since I love that series so much, it's only natural that I would have thought, well, if this is so good, I better seek out what this other thing is that's in there.
How funny. So how old were you when you watched Night of the Living Dead for the first time?
It would have probably been then maybe 11 or 12, something like that. Yeah. But unfortunately, I don't have a clear memory of when that was, but it would have had to have been around then. And I know I saw Halloween 2 right around when I was 10 or 11. So that would have followed shortly after.
Well, and let's take a broader view of the longevity of this genre, because we can point to Night of the Living Dead as being the birth of the modern what we sort of collectively think of as the movie zombie. Why? What is the appeal of more so than slasher movies and things like that? I feel like zombie movies have had a longevity that is kind of amazing.
Well, it goes back to certain more universal ideas about what makes the zombie such a potent figure in pop culture. And these are like, I hesitate to say simple, because, I mean, for anybody, it could be a moment where you think, oh, I never thought of it that way, and it's very intriguing. So it could very well be that some people would think, well, this is an interesting way of looking at it. For me, I say simple because then you start delving into so many more specifics. But in a general sense, the zombie is just one of the most basic, most simplistic ways to generate fear and to represent fear in a story, because you've taken what is basically a humanoid form, you've taken a human being, you've depersonalized them, dehumanized them in one way or another, and of course in many of these stories it's your family, it's your friends, it's basically the closest human figure you can get to yourself and the people that you love, and then you take that figure and you turn it into a vessel for whatever we're afraid of at any point in time in culture. And it's just so universal and so malleable for any time period that, like you just said, I mean, slasher movies come and go and there's reinventions, and really zombie movies come and go too. There's different interpretations, but it's just such a perfect, potent image that we keep reusing.
It's, what occurs to me is, there's the element of being you and not you, and that is extremely unsettling. And I think back to, these are, I suppose, what one could argue adjuncts. I think back to when I watched the first Planet of the Apes when I was a kid. The moment that I found most unnerving is when Charlton Heston finds, Robert Gunner, his crew member who's been lobotomized. And even as a little kid, I'm talking, gosh, I couldn't have been even 10 years old. And that part of that movie always just scared the shit out of me.
Oh, yeah. Of course, if there's one thing that I love as much as, if not more than really the Halloween movies or zombie stuff, it's Planet of the Apes.
Sure.
So, you had me on that one. And I think the age is probably about the same, too. I was probably 7 or 8 when I saw. Yeah.
Well,
so
and I draw that corollary, and actually this occurs to me as I'm talking to you, the best of both worlds on Star Trek.
Sure. My God.
Captain Picard, in effect, is turned into a zombie.
Absolutely. The Borg are zombies.
Yeah.
I count them. They're and certainly First Contact is a great zombie movie.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but oh boy, you're really hitting the touchstones today. So sure. Best of both worlds. The thing is, it's interesting. You're drawing that great line. How all of these things are about the exploration of dehumanization, and particularly, like you were just pointing out, the dehumanization of you yourself, because we're identifying with our heroes or with our heroes' friends. And it's the idea. And that's why in some of these zombie stories, one of the more intriguing little elements is, do they still remember? Yeah. Is there still a person in there? Not only does that bring up the ethical questions of whether it is truly right to just gun them down if there's a human trapped in a shell, but it also suggests that if you turn, what would your point of view experience be of, transforming into the other?
Yeah, and I think that goes to something. Certainly, it's a recurrent motif in the Romero films, where you have that one character whose point of view we were following, who reemerges as a ghoul. Absolutely,
and in particular, I don't know, just the first thing that occurs to me, and I think I talk about it a bit in the book too, is that I've always been fascinated by. Emge's transformation, Stephen's transformation.
That's exactly what I was thinking of.
Same thing. Yeah. And then, in retrospect, looking back at his behavior right after, and I always try to deconstruct, it's like, what is he remembering? What is he thinking when he leads them all down that little hallway, to where they made the false wall? And it's that kind of thing, exactly, that Romero explores quite a bit.
Well, and certainly for me, Romero was my in point. And I'm a relative latecomer to this genre, and I'm the furthest thing from an expert, because really Romero is it for me. I just couldn't get into the Russo, the Return of the Living Dead movies. I appreciated them, but I found the Romero canon much more unsettling.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So zeroing in on that specifically, with what he accomplished over his, what were they, 6? How many?
Six by the end.
6,
yeah.
Right. If you include Survival of the Dead, right? Yeah.
If we include it.
Yeah, right. and I gotta say, I was somewhat. I was nonplussed by that one. It didn't really land for me, unfortunately.
No.
That last one, but certainly, that the first 4 and Land of the Dead too. What in your mind is the secret of his success?
Well, it's both I wouldn't say it's much of a secret, but I would say that it's both a blessing and a curse. Ultimately, I think what it really comes down to is. Well, first of all, you go back to the original film, and there's a lot of misconception about that. Like, a lot of people think, oh, this is this incredible low-budget horror movie that made a lot of records before Blair Witch came along, and everybody was college buddies. And it's like, yeah, but they weren't unprofessional. They weren't amateurs. These were professional filmmakers. I think in revisiting the movie quite a bit in the last year or so, I've been newly taken by Romero's directing style and some of the really beautiful artistic things that he actually did, that I just get so wrapped up in the characters and the story that I tend not to look at the composition as much. And now I have been, and thinking about how that's beautiful. So he's a great director. He really knows how to shape a story and also make it work well along with things like music. He was deeply involved, as some directors sometimes aren't, with shaping the soundtrack. And so this is a man that had a keen understanding of storytelling. And then after Night and the slow buildup of its reputation and people like us back then telling him, you know, what you just did with Night is make the social statement. He then took that on board and said, well, you know what, now we're really going to do that. And that leads to Dawn. And then I think what really happened was you have a man who ultimately shaped a career, really, although he did many other things, his career was very defined by these zombie films and that ongoing series of let's keep revisiting this zombie apocalypse, often a little further along the way, although he shifted later. And
do you think he felt trapped by that?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I think but to finish, the one thing was that I think he then took on board the idea that it was his responsibility to make a statement. Fortunately, he's the kind of person who is talented enough to do that, until the last couple where I feel he was really spinning his wheels. And I agree with you that he felt trapped. I think it was very obvious, and I think that he unfortunately also fell victim to the same thing that a lot of people do, which is you have a very creative mind, you get older, younger people come along to build on what you created, and you're not necessarily the flavor of the month or the new thing anymore, and you either segue into that gracefully, or unfortunately, like Romero, you start doing very bitter interviews about how The Walking Dead is just a soap opera, and that's not how I would have done it.
Sure.
Except that The Walking Dead was a natural progression of everything he did. He was just not the person to do it anymore. And that's just the way things go sometimes.
That is interesting in that, the both the comics and the show certainly exist within a Romero verse. The zombies are his zombies, so to speak.
In some respects, yes, and in some respects, I point out where they aren't. For instance, Kirkman, of course, Robert Kirkman has always said that The Walking Dead was inspired directly by the idea of let's make the zombie movie that never ends, which I feel we've now discovered also has its own pitfalls.
Man, you ain't kidding.
Yeah, but he also is very adamant about, this was inspired by Romero, which is true, but it did also very much shape its own universe. One of the key things I always point out as an example, for instance, is that if you watch Night of the Living Dead, the ghouls that start off Romero's version of the zombie cower from fire like Frankenstein's monster. They're terrified of it like an animal. They are also turned away by light. And they even go out of their way to smash the headlights and get rid of the light. But they hate fire. The walkers in The Walking Dead will walk right into a blaze like nothing is in front of them and just keep walking while they're on fire. They do not have the same behavior. So there are elements of it where, probably by virtue of Kirkman shaping the story he wanted to tell and then the TV series, they've created a version that is Romero-esque but does have different behavior. The walkers are a bit different from the ghouls and the zombies of Romero's universe.
Well, just cycling back to what you were saying earlier, I find it fascinating that Romero didn't necessarily go into the original film with any real social commentary specifically in mind. That's something that sort of got that later readings tacked on. Is that, am I interpreting right what you said?
I think that what happened, and when you look at contemporary interviews and then keep tracking forward, like let's say the 10 years between Night and Dawn, what it really seems to be is they all got together, they wanted to make a midnight horror movie. By virtue of the kind of people they were and the time they were living in, like so many other things, they were going to naturally infuse it with some of their own ideas. I think if any one person on that team could be directly credited with actually thinking consciously of making a statement in any way, it would be Dwayne Jones.
Sure.
But
who played Ben? Who played the lead character?
Yeah. Who played the lead character, Ben? Right. And I feel that after the fact, the more Romero and Russo and the others, well, Romero in particular, I think, the more he was told, you were a genius. This is a commentary on Vietnam and race riots and the destruction of the nuclear family. And as those 10 years went on, it eventually became Romero saying, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe we were thinking all that and we did it. But I don't think that they sat down and said, let us craft a socially relevant horror movie. They were trying to make something they could sell. And then we all came along afterward and said, yes, but you also did this. And then when Dawn comes along, it's very much top of mind. Like, all right, now we have to do something that's socially relevant. What shall we do? And history conspired to just drop the perfect metaphor in his lap with the mall, and off we're running.
And to me, certainly, Dawn of the Dead is my favorite of his films for a variety of reasons. I actually just reacquired the collector's set on DVD.
It is ridiculously difficult to get a hold of that movie these days.
It's baffling to me that it's not in print on Blu-ray. It's not available in streaming. And I had that collector's set. It's like a 4-disc thing. Mm-hmm. And this, this is like my life. Somebody got into my garage and stole that.
That's a very specific choice.
It was very, I'll tell you the stuff they stole. This is absolutely true. My Dawn of the Dead collector's set and my complete Dallas series on DVD.
Oh my!
So,
this is just like a connoisseur of fine film and television.
Clearly.
And they couldn't get it themselves, and it's like, well, I'm gonna have to rob somebody.
It's right here, yeah. So I find it just arrived in the mail a couple days ago, and now I'm like trying to find a time to watch it because I can't be like, come on, kids, let's watch Dawn of the Dead. I don't think that'll work. But
tonight's the European cut.
Yeah, that's right. But what I love about the movie is how gritty it is. I mean, it feels. Yeah. It doesn't feel. This is going to sound bad, and I don't mean it. It doesn't feel "quote unquote" professional.
No, but I know what you mean. In the way you're saying, it feels like a documentary. It feels real.
That's exactly right. Most of these actors, they're not familiar faces outside of this movie, really.
Right. Absolutely. And that's what Night is often credited with. And in many ways, I feel actually Dawn is even better in that respect, that it really feels like you're just getting a look into that world.
So with that in mind, I mean the metaphors are pretty front and center. But do you feel? I mean, the age of the shopping mall is kind of done. It feels like, or at least on the way out. Do you feel that the metaphors of Dawn of the Dead will continue to resonate even despite that?
Well, one of the things that I always teach in any of my media literacy classes, and really try to instill in students, is the idea that nothing really ages in terms of being able to utilize it as a text for interpreting and coming up with meaning and like resonance for the present as well as the past. So, for instance, some things may work better than others, but for instance, I teach lately, I've been teaching a lot of freshman composition classes, and I use Night of the Living Dead every semester. We're watching a movie that for these kids is like, it's not only before their time, but it's 50 years old now, exactly.
Yeah.
And after they get past the first 10, 15 minutes and get used to black and white, many of them will say they've never seen a black and white movie before, and get past the stilted acting and some of the things that granted are there, it's amazing how quickly they get emotionally invested in the characters and start talking back at the screen or yelling at Harry or, being absolutely shocked with gasps of alarm by the ending. And it still works. And one of the things I always tell them is, here's the thing. This movie may be 50 years old, but you as a student in 2018 can still watch it and say, this still means something. This still resonates about this and this and this. And one of the things, unfortunately, that's also true is that many of the themes reflected in many of these old movies and TV shows are still issues we're struggling with today.
Yeah.
We haven't really changed that much, and we haven't really improved a lot of things or learned. And so they do stand the test of time. And I think, yes, a kid today watching Dawn of the Dead will find the mall quaint. But the idea of consumerism is still the same. And
Sure.
all you have to do is tell them, yes, but think about this in terms of online shopping today, and how would that play out, and what would that, metaphor be? And before you know it, they understand, and you move on.
Well, and I think what you say is really a key to why that film in particular, the original Dawn of the Dead, why it really does continue to unnerve, because it is something that is within our realm of experience, this idea of going to the shopping mall. And I mean, certainly for me, whenever I go to a mall, I can't help but sort of superimpose Dawn of the Dead on top of that and be like, where am I hiding? Where am I going? There's just something unnerving about an empty shopping mall. Well,
this is the thing, is that now that the mall era is really dying, and a lot of our malls are dying, they almost seem even more appropriate to Dawn than they ever were, because now you can play that game in these malls.
So let me ask you, I mean, Day of the Dead, it feels like, it wasn't particularly well received at the time for a variety of budget reasons, whatever. It seems like things have come around where that is appreciated now. But where do you think that movie fell down? I mean, in terms of there was obviously the anticipation of Romero returning, and the movie didn't necessarily turn out as well as he would have liked, or audiences would have liked at that moment.
There are interviews he's done where he said that Day was his favorite. So I know that there is an element of, even if it misfired in some sense, an element that he liked that the best as a representation of what he could do in the zombie genre. And as far as where it failed, it's hard to say. I mean, the thing is, I've always liked it, but I really do feel, particularly in writing about it, I really feel like my estimation of it has gone up even further.
Sure.
And obviously it has a lot of really strong and potent ideas and imagery. I still always say, every time I talk about it, I always say I still think that movie in 1985 is still the pinnacle of practical zombie effects in any film.
Well, that opening sequence with that dude with the hole. I mean,
the tongue, it's just amazing. There's still one shot that always gets me, and every time I know it's coming, I'm still amazed. There's the shot where the zombies tear one of the guys apart, and it's an unbroken shot, and they eventually grab his head and pull his head off, and you realize that the entire time it's been on screen, that's been an animatronic head. But it is so well done. And of course, these days they just CGI in the fake for the real, and it would happen in front of you, and it would be seamless. This is being done in one shot, and clearly it's always fake. They're not swapping anything, and yet he looks real until the moment they start pulling him apart. It's a testament to Savini and Nicotero and everybody that was working on that. But where it failed, I mean, I guess if nothing else, we could say that it suffered from what a lot of the movies suffered from at the time, which is if you had a movie that wasn't rated or that was, a particularly transgressive horror film, there was no place for it to go. It was going to be in lesser theaters. Eventually, of course, by the 80s, you're talking, well, it's going to come out on home video, but they're going to put it in the corner in the back with all the horror stuff that's right next to the curtain for the porn section. There's an element of isolation to all that meant that you had to discover it. You had to find it as a fan. You couldn't. Today, Day of the Dead would just come out, just be released, and but then it was a struggle to be recognized.
And I mean, it's interesting to me, what you say about how with each entry he's carrying the zombie apocalypse forward, and I think that allows for this really fascinating progression of humans becoming inhuman, literally, and that they're becoming zombies, but also that the people that are left are just friggin' assholes. It's
right. I know you're thinking about Rhodes and everybody else there.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Pilato is just chewing the scenery. He's great. He's a great villain. But you were mentioning The Walking Dead earlier. Just drawing a corollary to that. I mean, I honestly, I reached a point with The Walking Dead where right around the time Jeffrey Dean Morgan showed up and he's battering people with the baseball bat and stuff, I just stopped watching at that point.
Well, you and I share that.
Oh,
I mean, the thing is, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, just to put a pin on that, I reached a point where I'm like, this is misery porn. This is, I don't need this in my, like, I'm spending literally years with characters who, to some extent, they're taking up emotional capital in my head, and I don't want to see them battered and bloodied like this. It's just too much for me.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
We are 100% in agreement. It is, and the thing is, when I was doing the podcast originally, we started it primarily as Walking Dead as a way of anchoring it in something that was clearly popular, and we could do on a weekly basis, and then embroider around that, particularly when the show was off, and be able to showcase, bring some of my expertise and the scholarship I'd done to it, and initially enjoyed it a great deal. And then as the show went on, one of the things, this goes back to what I was hinting at earlier, one of the things you discover when you try to tell the zombie story that never ends is that stories generally need an end.
Yes.
You actually do need an end. And you can tell another story, but you need to start another story. Once you have spun out this premise, you're just winding up asking and answering the same moral and ethical questions that have been asked and answered 400 times already to everyone's satisfaction. There is nothing new to learn, nothing new to be said.
So
and
true.
then exactly my point is I have watched hundreds of these movies. I've watched all this stuff. It's part of what I'm doing professionally. And yet when I watched the premiere where Negan beats Glenn to death, I was done.
Yeah.
And my wife, we were sitting and watching it, and she said she had never seen me have such a visceral reaction to something. And I was like, yeah, I've seen people torn apart in 1,000 movies, but this is torture for the sake of it. It's torture for entertainment. It's cruelty that is reveling in the cruelty for no reason other than to get ratings. And the thing that shocked me the most was that premiere was promoting itself in the lead up to airing with the full knowledge that many of us out there already knew what was coming because, of course, the comic had already done it.
That's right.
So they were either going to stick to it or give it a twist. In the end, they did that pretty much exactly right. But the promotion for the episode was very much like, hey, watch the season premiere and watch Glenn's head smashed in like a pumpkin.
Right.
And it's like, that's not only is that not entertaining to me, it's offensive. And it's not offensive because of the violence. Of course, I also had to deal with a lot of people on Twitter who, like many people on Twitter, absolutely failed to understand the point of whatever you're talking about.
Right.
It was not the
Twitter?
violence.
No.
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it. It was not the violence or the gore. It was the fact that it was done for no purpose other than the sensationalism of it, that we were actually tuning in to enjoy that ostensibly. And I thought, you're done. You have nothing more meaningful to say. The story is just going to keep cycling. They're just going to meet yet another bad guy, yet another attempt to rebuild. I mean, they'd already done it already with the governor. They just hadn't done it. They upped the ante. And to me, Negan came along at a time, too, where I thought if I really want to watch a story unfold about, a crazed, sociopath who's imposing a fascist dictatorship on a group of people and beating everybody about the head, both physically and mentally, I can just turn on the news because that's happening right now.
So true.
So I was done. And there were a lot of people that thought, how can you, the zombie expert, turn off The Walking Dead? And I thought, easy. Haven't turned it back on yet.
Yeah, no, I'm in the same boat, and it brings to mind the wisdom in how Romero approached this universe, which was we're gonna dip back in and follow new groups of characters dealing with different scenarios, because the truth of it is that at the end of Dawn of the Dead, for all we know, Peter and Fran got away. At the end of Day of the Dead, for all we know, our characters got away. We know that if you're living amidst a zombie apocalypse, whatever happy ending you have is temporal at best. Mm-hmm. But we don't need to, we don't need to see that. Like, there's something about literalizing that, where we see the limits of that approach, and we see it on The Walking Dead. But I think. For me, Like, I love Land of the Dead, and I feel like I'm part of a select minority because I feel like a lot of people don't, which is kind of a shame. I think there's a lot in that movie.
I think it's the last one of his that you can really argue has some real substance to it.
Yeah, I mean, the
Yeah.
whole thing. I'll tell you. I mean, you talk about things that are unnerving. For me, the ghouls making their way through Fiddler's Green. It's evocative of Prince Prospero at the end of Mask of the Red Death or something.
It's beautiful. It's actually beautiful imagery in that, and stuff that really weaves that movie into not just zombie movie history, but horror history as well. Like them walking through the water, which to me always reminds me of even Zombies Immortal, which isn't the most expertly crafted film, but it's still, one of the early zombie movies that's of interest if you're delving into the history of it. And it's some beautiful stuff. And yeah, I mean, after that, I don't feel he had really anything more to say. And in Diary particularly, he was almost lifting and chunks of dialogue verbatim from Blair Witch. It was like rather than create his own ideas, he was borrowing them from another movie, and that felt wrong for someone like him to do that. So Land of the Dead I feel Land of the Dead is like his final solid statement on the zombies of his universe.
Well, and I mean, why did he decide to? I mean, was it just curiosity of like, hey, can I try making a found footage movie? You're getting older and you want to try to keep up with the new trends. Was it as simple as that? Why he decided to wind the clock back and restart the zombie apocalypse?
I mean, as far as I can tell, yes, to a certain extent there was that idea, well, what can we do now? And that was an approach that was certainly very popular and still continues to be, mainly because very often it's also very often an incredibly disappointing experience, because it's very often just a very cheap way for a bunch of people to be able to put a movie together, is do the found footage approach. But The problem is it also inherently, it's usually structured as basically an hour and a half joke with a punchline. You're going to get maybe one reveal, like Blair Witch, of course, famously doesn't even give you that really. And I get the feeling that he was like, hey, all these kids are doing these found footage movies. What can we do with zombies with that? And there's some things in Diary that are kind of interesting, but I still feel when I look at that, and I can't look at it much, it's a movie that there's even a sequence of dialogue that's almost verbatim what Josh says to Heather in Blair Witch. It's like if all you have is thematic material that you're lifting from the other movie that helped to, spur on the found footage revival and phenomenon, then there's nothing really here that you have to say. And it just is ultimately a failure of an experiment, I think. Survival, I just can't even muster much energy to talk about.
Yeah, I hear you, in all honesty, I think one of the major ways both of those films fall down is that none of the human protagonists are particularly compelling.
Well, that's the thing too, is that in both of them, we've come so far down from the kind of characterization and storytelling he was doing, certainly in the first three, and then even in Land. Land initially felt like it was less, than the previous films, but in retrospect, maybe in comparison to what followed, you realize, no, there's good character. Dennis Hopper makes for a great villain who's, something only Hopper could have done. that kind of character, and some very interesting stuff. Certainly in terms of the evolution of the zombie, there's some interesting stuff going on there. But yeah, it does feel kind of like the end of the road at that point.
Well, and as the road diverges, before we start talking about some of the more modern iterations, I did want to get your thoughts on the Tom Savini, the remake of Night from 1990.
I like the Night of the Living Dead remake a lot. Again, like I said about Day, my estimation of that remake has gone up substantially. A lot of my insight into it now is informed entirely by watching it with Natalie, who saw things in it that I never saw and that I now find even more compelling, particularly the fact that her interpretation of the Barbara in that, which of course we've always talked about how, that Barbara is a sort of Riplified Ripley-fied Barbara.
Right.
And very much an answer to the catatonic Barbara in the first film. And but I can't remember exactly word for word. I think Natalie and I talked about it in our show, and I certainly built on that when I was writing about it for the book too. Is that she picked up on one particular line of dialogue where they're trying to talk her down at one point. I think Tony Todd's Ben is trying to say to her, calm down, you're going crazy, calm down. And she has this bit where she says something like, I'm not going to let anybody ever take anything away from me again. And Natalie's reaction was, this woman has been raped or abused. Wow. And everything that this Barbara is displaying in Night of the Living Dead is someone who was a victim turning into a survivor and determined to control her environment and never let anyone take control again. And when we started looking at it from that lens, I was like, well, damn, that's all right there. And I never saw that before.
Me either.
And it makes that character even more compelling. And already Pat Tallman's Barbara is a very cool character. And then we also talked about the fact that when you watch that Ben, Tony Todd's Ben is not in control like Dwayne Jones's Ben. Tony Todd's Ben is ineffectual from the beginning and panicked and confused, and ultimately just a counterpoint to a far more villainous and cartoonish Harry. And the two of them are determined to take everyone down with them. They are like quintessential toxic male figures who are destroying that world. And so like all these different things. And it's like, I already liked the movie. I always thought it had this great nihilistic mood that's in some ways more apocalyptic and frightening than the original. And now I like it even more.
It is interesting to me because the way you describe how the character of Ben was repositioned in the remake, I didn't even think about it that way. But you're really bang on,
It's fascinating. It's in some ways I think. Well, first of all, of course, the reason that movie suffered is because how is it not going to suffer? Everybody there's that fan reaction of how dare you do something. And the thing is, everybody involved with the original people, including Romero, so you'd think it would have had some goodwill there, but people were just unwilling to accept that one would exist. I think that's changed a great deal now, though. I think that movie is one of the ones that's really benefited from time and reevaluation. And I don't think as many people seem to actively dislike that as used to. Sure. So I think that movie has benefited a great deal from.
It's crazy that the remake is older now than the original one was back then.
Oh my God, I can't stand when stuff like that happens. Like when people say, like, I saw somebody tweeting something like, "Do you know that it's like it's longer now Back to the Future than it was for Marty going back to 1955 and Back to the Future?" And I'm like, "Shut up! Stop that! I know I'm old." But
now the remake, my understanding is it essentially came into being because it was a way for Romero and Russo to finally make money off of the goodwill that the original movie had accrued.
In a sense, yeah, and also an attempt to try to at least like regain some control of the title and the identity. I mean, it's part of that whole long, convoluted, and sometimes kind of confusing copyright story and about the original. I mean, nothing they did was going to reassert copyright over the prints of the original film.
Right.
So all they could try to do was try to, in some cases, muddy the waters, but try to reassert ownership of aspects of it. And the idea for Romero was to do Night of the Living Dead 1990 and try to reclaim a bit of control that way. Russo's approach was to shoot all that new footage for the 30th anniversary re-release of the movie and edit together a version that had that and call that Night of the Living Dead. So both of them over the years were trying different things. And to some extent, they have finally succeeded. Although Romero now, sad, doesn't get to see like the end of that story. And that now with the Scorsese-led 4K restoration that Criterion has put out, it's enabled them to put a copyright notice on that and say that particular version of Night of the Living Dead is copyright 2016, Image 10. And The thing is, though, that doesn't change anything. That doesn't change anything about the original prints of the film. But I'm fairly sure that in the years to come, we're going to see the original prints far less in circulation as they do everything they can to try to make sure that their version of it is what stays out there for people so they can try to control it. I mean, they're also older people now. There are a few of them left. They're trying in some sense, I guess, to establish their legacy for their families too, who frankly probably haven't benefited nearly as much as they should have from the impact this one movie has had on everybody.
Yeah. Well, and we alluded to it earlier, but we've spent a lot of time talking about Romero, but let's talk about the Russo divergence, if you will.
Yeah.
Again, I mentioned I wasn't crazy about it. Doesn't mean I'm not. I can't appreciate it, but do you think the Russo films that the ones that spun off, all the Return of the Living Dead sequels, do you think they hold up? I mean, if we think of a zombie movie being only as strong as its metaphor, do the Return of the Living Dead movies hold up to that scrutiny?
Well, I think the original Return of the Living Dead movie is one of those modern classics that most people seem to love, or at least, as you say, at least be able to acknowledge, like, yes, I see what that movie is doing. It's I love it. I revisit it all the time. I think it's an excellent example of we mentioned a truly nihilistic and apocalyptic film that's perfectly suited for the middle of the 1980s when it came out.
Yeah.
It's also
I should mention, Arnold, by the way, that Return of the Living Dead is, in fact, the very first zombie movie. That's what got me down this rabbit hole.
Very interesting.
About 11 years ago.
That one didn't stick with you, though.
Well, I like I said, I appreciated it. For what it was doing, specifically the first one. I didn't see the sequels until later, and it got me intrigued enough to go back and watch Night, and then from there I basically just tracked down the George Romero series. So okay. I can absolutely appreciate how so many zombie tropes started there. Brains and things like that started there.
The brain thing started, yeah.
And I found that the tone. The discordant tone I found fascinating. Like, I found it very unnerving how it was trying to tightrope between, scaring the crap out of you and making you laugh. And I found,
yes.
I found that very effective. And I mean, it's like beneath the Planet of the Apes level nihilistic. I mean, it doesn't get much darker than that ending.
No. Yeah, you're painting the wall with Franciscus's blood, and it's G-rated for the kids. So yeah, I agree. Return of the Living Dead. So it's also worth noting that although we often refer to it as like, well, this is the Russo track. So like Russo and Romero, I don't know the extent to which there was any like bad blood or something happened, and I still am not 100% clear on what that was. But obviously at some point they made an agreement with each other that they would both have the right to follow Night of the Living Dead. But at least one of the caveats that was always intriguing to a lot of fans is apparently in the deal they specifically said that Russo could use the phrase living dead in his titles, but Romero had to drop that and just use dead, which is why Dawn of the Dead is not Dawn of the Living Dead.
Right.
But then it took a little longer for Russo to finally get something done, which wound up being the same year that Romero was already on his third film. But it's also worth noting that although Russo's branch is Return of the Living Dead, it really isn't his, because he had written a novel first, then that went into development. The movie that became the Return of the Living Dead that became that film is completely different, almost entirely, from Russo's novel. And was written by Dan O'Bannon. And Russo later did a novelization of the movie, but he felt like he had all of it taken away from him.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So Russo never really got to do his Return of the Living Dead or his version of a night thread, except in some of the comics he wound up writing years later, I think for Avatar. And Russo's aesthetic, quite frankly, is very exploitative and quite a bit, I would say, I'll just say quite a bit less substantive in certain respects than what Romero was doing. And even up to today, though, Russo's still out there doing stuff. He just appeared in a movie called My Uncle John is a Zombie.
Oh, wow.
Which is supposed to technically kind of be sort of a follow-up to Night. He's kind of supposed to be his zombie from Night, even though he's definitively killed in Night, and now he's like a grandpa zombie. And I think it's George Kazana's last film appearance, who played Sheriff McClellan. And for fans, it's probably fun to take a look at.
Right.
But, you're probably not going to find the same level of meaning in that.
Yeah, and the Return of the Living Dead series, I feel like, I mean, by the time they got to like the fourth or fifth ones that were like TV movies, basically, right?
Yeah.
They lost the thread a little bit from what I could tell.
Oh yeah, and the first one I think is brilliant. I think there's a lot of stuff in that first movie that really is just absolutely brilliant and stands the test of time. The second one, there are many people that are very fond of the second one. Part of that, I think, too, is that James Karen and Tom Matthews from the first movie come back in the second one as different characters, but also going through the same transformation again. There's even a joke in that about, I feel like we've done this before. And it's much funnier and far less of a balance between horror and comedy, much more just a horror comedy. And although I know there are a lot of people that are affectionate for it, I think too is just terrible. I don't find the humor funny, and I don't think it's really all that good. But there are plenty of people that do like it a lot. And then I think most people would agree by the time you get to 4 and 5, those are pretty much trash. But the third one is also kind of interesting. The third one with Melinda Clarke.
That's right.
As the title, the main Living Dead character in that. There's some interesting stuff in there. It's very low budget, it's very cheesy, and there's a lot of silliness and stupidity. But there's also kind of a spark of a really cool idea in having this sort of gothed out, empowered zombie girl.
Yeah.
That makes it worth checking out. But that's the last one, I think.
It certainly feels very early 90s in its approach and its aesthetic. And I think, I think for me, if I were to put a pin on why I preferred the Romero track is the whole trioxin thing, the idea that it's a chemical that's doing this, that I found that less appealing than the idea that it's just a thing and it's gonna happen to you whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. There's just something far more terrifying about that.
Yeah, I always used to say that I like the idea that in Romero's universe there's this implication that there was just a switch thrown in the universe one day and death doesn't work anymore. I do, however, also point out that when you really watch Night of the Living Dead, Night of the Living Dead does go out of the way to really establish that it's radiation from the Venus probe.
Yeah, that's right.
And although Romero and the others spent decades afterward denying that was the intent and saying, well, it's just in there, but really it's not supposed to be. It's like, yes, but the movie not only repeats it, but even has a moment where they say scientists are currently measuring the radiation and it's still there in all the places where the unburied dead are. Basically, the movie goes out of its way to tell you this is in fact what's happening, and as long as that radiation is detectable, they're going to come back. So on the one hand, it is in essence a throwback homage to 50s science fiction, which is part of what they were doing.
Right.
On the other hand, in order to really enjoy it from the more profound level, you can still say, well, yes, the radiation, but ultimately what we're really talking about is a world in which death has changed its meaning.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters.
So with that in mind, the 2004, the Zack Snyder James Gunn remake of Dawn of the Dead. Now this is again fairly. It seems like in fan circles very polarizing. I've said I think it's a great thriller. I don't find it a particularly effective zombie movie. In that, to me, I just don't find running, jumping zombies as scary as shambling, decaying zombies. But I do think that it's one of the few examples of a remake that does something interesting where you can watch it side by side with the original and you're going to get two different experiences out of them.
Absolutely. And I like that movie a lot. I think that, if somebody asked me personally, you make the choice, what would you prefer? I would say, well, I prefer slow zombies as my favorite. But the other thing too is it's indicative of a time and place. The fast zombie has its own kind of meaning, and particularly post 9/11, we're talking about this major resurgence of the zombie as an unstoppable juggernaut of terrorism and destruction, and it makes sense. And but there's a lot about that movie I love. I think the characterization is very strong. I think. Basically, I feel like if that movie had just been given a different title, it wouldn't have been maligned as much as it has been. And again, I think it's also benefiting from some reassessment. And again, it was watching that movie with Natalie that also made me see things differently again. And a lot of that had to do with her perception, again, of the central female character, of Sarah Polley's character of Anna.
Right.
And I always watch that opening sequence, for instance, where she comes home to her husband and takes his shoes off, and just thought, oh, what a nice domestic scene, and then he gets killed, and oh, how horrible, and everything. Natalie's take on it, however, was, did you notice how when she's at the hospital, she can barely, assert herself to the doctor when she's clearly been working longer than she should. And her friend asks, have you asked him yet if you can do this thing? Like, she needs to check with him. And when she goes home, he hasn't taken his shoes off, even though he's already in bed. She has to do it. And then there's the part where she said, and why is her car keys right there on the nightstand? She said, do you know anybody that brings their car keys up to the bedroom? You put it in front of the front door. You put it in, and I was thinking, yeah, wait a minute. And she said, this is the kind of person who has always been ready to run.
Wow.
And I thought, whoa,
that's amazing.
I have never thought of this before. And then looking back, I'm thinking she was pretty clear on how to get out through the bathroom. And I'm thinking, this is somebody who is, again, used to this kind of situation. And then I said, well, does this mean that her gravitating to Michael later, who seems like the nicest guy in the world, is part of that? Because he seems like a sensitive, empathetic person. And that puts a light on their relationship doesn't really develop all that much, but there are hints,
Yeah.
And so there was that. And I also find that the character of Michael is one of my favorite lead characters of any zombie movie ever, because he is such a self-effacing and yet obviously clever and manipulative, not in a bad way, but clever and manipulative person. He sizes people up immediately and knows how to get them to do things by making them feel as if they're the ones who are coming up with it. And then we find out, he just sold TVs at Best Buy. And he's like, well, he's a nobody. But no, because in the zombie apocalypse, a nobody is a somebody. So
And I think what you just hit on there is something about the enduring appeal of this genre, whatever form it takes, is in a weird way there's that fantasy element of who would I be in this scenario.
Yes. You get to reinvent yourself when there's no more bills to pay and there's no job to go to anymore. Who will you be? And it's to be perfectly honest, it's one of the elements of the genre I've never dwelled on too much in some of the other things I've written or talked about, but I think that's potentially one of the most potent, particularly for people who may feel lost in a sort of a modern world where there's so many responsibilities and things to do. But in this weird, perverse way, the end of the world is really freeing. There's so much less you have. I mean, the worries become very basic. It's about surviving the day, not, oh, I got to pay this. I got to get to that place at 2. I got to do this thing. And it's like, no, now you just have to find some food, find a place you can board up, and then start again tomorrow.
I mean, I think what you're saying, that like it's really illustrative of all the ways that, to a large extent, this genre, is ghettoized, in the eyes of many. Like, oh, it's gore porn, and yet there's so much going on. Even when we point to something like the 2004 remake, because people love to sort of toss tomatoes at Zack Snyder. And I'm always like, well, I mean, I've liked some of his output and I've disliked some of it, but I look at Dawn of the Dead and what he does with that film, which is really bereft of some of his larger stylistic flourishes. Mm-hmm. And it's really, he just lets the mood build for scenes. There's the great, when Matt Frewer Like the characters are like waiting for him to die, and I mean, it's just playing out in static shots.
I love that. Frewer's in like all 5 minutes of it, but he just owns the scene, and it's also maybe one of the most on the nose statements of a theme, but I just love it where he does the thing you want every single second, and it's just there's a lot of great stuff in Dawn of the Dead 2004.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I understand, like you were saying about the running zombie thing. There's an aesthetic to that you either respond to, or you don't. You can still look at it and say, yeah, it doesn't work as well. I mean, I always get those kind of questions too. Like a lot of people talk about the slow versus fast. I sometimes define it. It's not a perfect answer. There's always shades of gray, but I always define it as slow versus fast being very similar to the concept to me of, well, here's terror and here's horror. So terror is the visceral reaction to like the cheetah running you down. It's an engine of death and destruction. It's coming to eat you. It's much faster than you. It's much more powerful. It's going to catch you. You're dead. That's terror. Horror is like Michael Myers walking toward you from all the way down the road, or that one shambling zombie, and you think, well, this is easy. I can get away. And then there's another one to the right, and you go, that's all right. There's still 2 of them, and there's the third one, and then there's 50. And it's the slow realization that they're just going to keep going at the same pace, and they're still going to get you. That's horror. So depending on what you react to, what you respond to, both of those are valid ways to approach telling a quote-unquote horror story, but they have different functions.
I think you summed it up so perfectly. I mean, I remember a few years back, it was late at night, and my car was parked on the street, and it was somewhat hazy out. And as I'm opening my car, I glance down the street, and I see, what appears to me to be just a form that's very slowly clambering towards me. And, this is maybe a block and a half down. And it turns out it's just like this old lady who's like walking her dog, But I'll tell you that 15 seconds of me trying to figure out what the hell I was seeing, and like the tumblers clicking in my head wrongly, where I'm like, this is it, zombie apocalypse, this is where it starts, which I think far too often, by the way. I've realized that.
Oh, we all do.
But to me, there's just something about that, about slowly encroaching dread, because I think. And again, this is less a question of like, oh, this is better, this is worse, but I think for me, the appeal of the clambering, shambling zombie is what it represents for after. So in other words,
yes,
there's the sense of like, this is what I'm going to become. Whereas, the Snyder zombies, or if we want to draw the cord to Alex Garland in 28 Days, they're like war machines. You know what I mean? They're
animals.
They're animals, exactly. Right.
Yeah, I mean, they even growl like cougars. I mean, the sounds they make they're just animals.
Right.
So yeah,
which is certainly terrifying in its own way, as you say.
Yeah, and what you just said goes back to one of your earlier points too. It's which sounds like that's one of the key things for you, is that the zombie, particularly the slow shambling zombie, isn't just a reflection of death. It's a reflection of you're going to be that thing, the loss of your identity, and transformation. And then what's always fascinating in a lot of zombie stories is when a character either chooses or does not choose consciously. You know what? I'm going to let it happen and see what happens on the other side.
Yeah, and as I said, I mean, those are the most unnerving moments. Even Leguizamo in Land of the Dead.
Yes,
I'm going to see how the other side lives, or something. That's what he says, right?
And he's also one of those ones that's kind of interesting in that some of the stuff he does right after is very much obviously informed by
who he
hates when he was alive. Yeah, right. So there's something still working in there, even if it's just happening because of inertia. There's something going on in there.
Man, this is a genre that continues to populate our imagination, And I think it says something about not just the enduring appeal of what George Romero and John Russo started 50 years ago exactly, if you're listening to this episode the day that it drops, but also says something about our collective fears as a people, and the fears that draw us together. So I think that's something special and distinctive about zombie movies.
Absolutely. It's a genre that stretches back much earlier than them, and initially begins with some serious cultural appropriation. And then, if we just look at From Night and this last 50 years, what they did was take some elements of that and some elements of other things and really create something almost entirely new that then provided this perfect form in which to make all these statements about human nature. And everybody that's come after has either been building on what they did, deliberately trying to counter that in one way or another, but it's all grown out of that sort of seismic event of Night of the Living Dead in 1968.
Well, I couldn't think of a better way of celebrating the 50th anniversary of that film than by chatting with you. So, Arnold, thank you so much for coming on the show. And listeners, the book is Journey of the Living Dead, a tribute to 50 years of Flesh Eaters, and it is available now. So please do check it out. As I said before we got on mic, I'm about a third of the way through, and I'm quickly devouring it.
That's the best way to do it.
But Arnold, if I know that you have an online presence, etc., I'm sure our listeners would love to reach out to you. Do you want to spread your social media channels, etc.?
Sure. So everybody can find me on Twitter at Doctor of the Dead. That's easy enough. I'm just now finishing up, as we're recording, a 50-tweet 50th anniversary Night of the Living Dead thread that was part of my promotion for the book, where I've been providing some very short 280 character commentary on the whole Night of the Living Dead. Started on April 30th, which was the date that the movie actually begins its events, and the last tweet will hit on October 1st, the release date of the film. And they can find the book at atbpublishing.com/zombie.
Now, I should mention that ATB Publishing also puts out the Outside In series, which I got to be a participant in. I was in the 174 New Perspectives on 174 Star Trek The Next Generation stories. So I have a little essay in that, so I hope folks will check that out as well.
Absolutely. We love doing the Outside In books, and the one coming up in about a month or so is the fifth in the series, and we're jumping from the Doctor Who and the Star Trek universes over to Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
That's right. I remember hearing about that. Well, Arnold, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you will come back again and spend another hour delving into another corner of Nostalgia Theater with me.
I would be very happy to do that anytime.
Well, thank you so much. And for those of you listening, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of this episode. And I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Blumberg, and I do hope you'll check out the book. But in addition to that, I hope you will go to iTunes and leave a review, leave a star rating. Every little bit helps. Tell me what you think of the show by emailing me at moviefilmpodcast@gmail.com or hitting like on our Facebook page, facebook.com/moviefilmpodcast. You can also follow me on Twitter at Zacky's Corner. That's ZAKI's Corner. That's also my website, justanda.com. I'll be back in just a few short weeks with our next excursion into another shadowy corner of Nostalgia Theater. But until then, my name is Zaki Hassan, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening.